I'm Rachel, 22 years old, and what was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life turned into the most humiliating family betrayal I could have imagined. At my college graduation dinner, surrounded by extended family celebrating my summa cum laude honors degree, my father stood up and announced with a laugh that I was now old enough to pay rent or get out of the family home. The next day, when I moved out with nothing but my clothes and dignity, I had no idea that within 6 months, karma would come for him in ways that would leave our entire family begging me to come back. But by then, I'd already built something they could never touch or take away. Before we dive into this absolutely wild story of family greed backfiring spectacularly, I need to hear your predictions. What do you think happened when I left? How do you think this played out? Drop your guesses in the comments and hit that like button because this revenge story is going to show you exactly why you should never underestimate the quiet ones. Subscribe because the way this family learned their lesson is pure justice, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Growing up as the youngest of 3 children in the Williams household meant mastering the art of being invisible while simultaneously being perfect. My parents, Michael and Patricia Williams, had built their middle-class lifestyle around careful financial planning, social appearances, and the expectation that their children would contribute to the family's success story without requiring too much investment in return. My older siblings, David and Lauren, had set a clear precedent for what was expected of Williams' children. David had graduated college with decent grades, found a steady job in accounting, and moved out at 23 to start his own life. Lauren had followed a similar path, earning her degree in elementary education and moving in with her boyfriend shortly after graduation. Both had received modest financial support from our parents during college, help with textbooks, occasional grocery money, and the understanding that they could live at home rent-free until they were financially stable enough to move out on their own timeline. I had assumed the same rules would apply to me, especially given that I had exceeded every expectation they had ever set. While David and Lauren had been average students who required tutoring and constant supervision to maintain acceptable grades, I had been naturally gifted academically and motivated to excel. I graduated high school as valedictorian, earned a full academic scholarship to the state university, and maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA throughout my 4 years of study. My academic achievements weren't just about grades. I had double majored in computer science and business administration, completed 3 internships with major tech companies, and had already received multiple job offers with starting salaries that exceeded what my father made after 20 years in his manufacturing management position. I had accomplished all of this while working part-time throughout college to cover my personal expenses, never asking my parents for the kind of financial support they had freely given my siblings. The irony was that I had been the easiest, most self-sufficient child they had ever raised. I had never been in trouble, never required expensive interventions or support, never caused family drama or required crisis management. I had been quietly, consistently successful in ways that should have made any parent proud. But somewhere along the way, my success had become an expectation rather than an achievement worthy of recognition. My perfect grades were taken for granted, my job offers were dismissed as lucky breaks, and my academic honors were treated as the natural result of having advantages that my siblings hadn't enjoyed. In my parents' narrative, I hadn't earned my success through hard work and talent. I had simply been given opportunities that made success inevitable. The family financial dynamics had always been complex and somewhat opaque. My parents were comfortable but not wealthy, careful about major expenses but willing to invest in things they viewed as important or worthwhile. They had helped David buy his first car, contributed to Lauren's wedding expenses, and provided both of my siblings with financial assistance during their early career transitions. But their approach to my achievements and future had been notably different. When I received my full scholarship, they expressed satisfaction that they wouldn't have to pay for college rather than pride in my academic accomplishments. When I earned money through internships and part-time work, they commented on how nice it was that I could take care of my own expenses. When I received job offers with impressive starting salaries, they mentioned how I wouldn't need help getting started like my siblings had. I had interpreted this difference as confidence in my abilities and respect for my independence. I thought they were proud that I had exceeded their expectations and achieved success without requiring their financial support. I believed that their hands-off approach reflected their trust in my judgment and their recognition that I was capable of managing my own life. Looking back, I can see that I was naive about the resentment that was building beneath the surface. My success had apparently created expectations that I would not only be self-sufficient but would also contribute to the family's financial well-being in ways my siblings never had. My parents had begun viewing my achievements not as reasons for celebration but as indicators that I no longer needed or deserved the kind of support they had provided to David and Lauren. The shift in their attitude had been gradual and subtle, easy to miss when I was focused on completing my degree and preparing for my career. Comments about how lucky I was to have job opportunities became more frequent. Observations about my advantages became more pointed. References to my easy path became more common, as if my academic success had somehow required less effort and sacrifice than my siblings' more modest achievements. But I had been so focused on making them proud, on living up to their expectations, on proving that their investment in raising me had been worthwhile, that I missed the signs that their pride had curdled into something else entirely. I thought my graduation would be a celebration of our shared success, my achievement reflecting well on their parenting, their support having contributed to my accomplishments. Instead, as I would discover at what should have been my moment of triumph, they had developed very different ideas about what my success owed to them and what obligations it created for my future. The graduation ceremony itself was everything I had dreamed it would be. Walking across that stage to receive my diploma summa cum laude, hearing my name announced with my double major and academic honors, seeing the genuine pride and excitement on my professors' faces, it felt like the culmination of 4 years of hard work and the beginning of an exciting future. My parents, siblings, and several extended family members had come to the ceremony, and I was touched that they had made the effort to be there for my big day. During the reception afterward, relatives congratulated me on my achievements and asked about my job prospects. I shared the news about the multiple offers I had received, including one from a prestigious tech company that came with an impressive starting salary and excellent benefits. "Rachel's really done well for herself," my aunt commented to my parents. "You must be so proud of how she's turned out." "Oh, we are," Mom replied, though I noticed a tightness in her smile that I couldn't quite interpret. "She's always been very self-directed." Dad nodded along, adding, "Independent to a fault, that one. Never needed much from us." At the time, I interpreted their comments as recognition of my self-sufficiency and maturity. Looking back, I can see they were already setting up the narrative that would justify what came next. The graduation dinner was held at a nice restaurant downtown, with our extended family gathering to celebrate what everyone assumed was a proud family milestone. The atmosphere was festive and warm, with relatives sharing stories about my childhood achievements and expressing excitement about my future career prospects. I had prepared a short speech to thank my family for their support throughout my education, acknowledging the ways they had encouraged my academic pursuits and expressing gratitude for the foundation they had provided that made my success possible. I was genuinely grateful for their role in my achievements and wanted to publicly recognize their contributions to my accomplishments. But before I could deliver my prepared remarks, Dad stood up with his wine glass raised, commanding attention from the entire table. His expression was jovial, and I initially assumed he was going to offer a toast celebrating my graduation or expressing pride in my achievements. "I'd like to say something about our graduate here," he began, gesturing toward me with a broad smile. "Rachel has certainly accomplished a lot, and we're happy to see her succeed. But you know what this really means?" He paused for effect, looking around the table at our relatives who were waiting expectantly for his fatherly tribute. "It means she's officially old enough to pay rent or get out." The comment was delivered with a laugh, as if it were a light-hearted joke rather than a serious ultimatum. But the silence that followed was deafening. Our relatives looked confused and uncomfortable, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh along with what seemed like a poorly timed attempt at humor. "Michael," Mom said quietly, her voice carrying a warning tone that suggested this wasn't the time or place for whatever point he was trying to make. But Dad continued, apparently oblivious to the awkward atmosphere he had created. "I'm serious. She's got a good job lined up, she's proven she can take care of herself, and it's time for her to start contributing to the household or find her own place. We've done our job raising her, and now it's time for her to do her job as an adult." The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a joke or a poorly chosen moment for humor, it was a public announcement that I was no longer welcome in the family home unless I began paying rent. At my own graduation dinner, in front of our extended family, my father was essentially evicting me while disguising it as a celebration of my independence. My Uncle David, Dad's brother, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mike, maybe this is something you should discuss privately with Rachel. Tonight's supposed to be about celebrating her achievements." "This is celebrating her achievements," Dad replied, his tone becoming more defensive. "I'm acknowledging that she's successful enough to support herself now. That's something to be proud of, right?" But the damage was done. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that permeated the rest of the dinner. Relatives tried to steer the conversation back to neutral topics, but the awkwardness lingered. My moment of triumph had been transformed into a public humiliation that I would never forget. Lauren attempted to lighten the mood by changing the subject to her upcoming vacation plans, while David tried to engage me in conversation about my job prospects as if nothing unusual had happened. But I could see the pity and confusion in our relatives' eyes, their inability to understand why my parents would choose this moment to essentially kick me out of the house. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and artificial cheerfulness. I went through the motions of thanking people for coming, accepting congratulations on my graduation, and pretending that my father's announcement hadn't completely destroyed what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my aunt pulled me aside privately. "Honey, I don't know what that was about, but if you need anything, a place to stay, help figuring things out, you call me, okay? Tonight should have been about celebrating you, not whatever that was." Her kindness in that moment was both comforting and devastating. It confirmed that my father's behavior had been as inappropriate and hurtful as I had perceived it to be, while also highlighting the fact that my own parents were less concerned about my well-being than my extended family was. On the drive home, the car was silent except for the sound of the radio playing quietly in the background. I stared out the window, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for my immediate future. My graduation day, which had started with such promise and pride, had ended with the realization that my parents viewed my success not as an achievement to be celebrated but as an opportunity to reduce their financial responsibilities toward me. I had less than 24 hours to figure out where I was going to live and how I was going to transition from college student living at home to fully independent adult with no family support system. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the achievements and memories of 22 years, I tried to make sense of what had happened and what my parents actually expected from me. The conversation we had after returning from the restaurant clarified their position in ways that were both shocking and illuminating. "Dad, can we talk about what you said at dinner?" I asked, finding him in the living room reading the newspaper as if nothing significant had occurred. "What's to talk about?" he replied without looking up from the sports section. "You're graduated, you've got a job lined up, it's time to start acting like an adult. That means either contributing to the household expenses or finding your own place." The casual tone, as if he were discussing whether rather than fundamentally changing our family relationship, was jarring. This wasn't a decision that had been made in the heat of the moment, it was a calculated plan that he had apparently been considering for some time. "But David and Lauren didn't have to pay rent when they lived here after graduation," I pointed out. "They both had several months to get settled in their jobs and save money before they moved out." Dad finally looked up from his newspaper, his expression showing mild irritation at having to explain something he considered obvious. "David and Lauren needed help getting established. They didn't have the advantages you've had. You've got multiple job offers, you've proven you can manage money responsibly, and you don't need the same kind of support they did." The logic was circular and self-serving. Because I had been successful and self-sufficient, I deserved less support than my siblings who had required more help. My achievements had somehow disqualified me from receiving the same consideration they had gotten as a matter of course. Mom joined the conversation, sitting down across from me with the expression she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while delivering unreasonable ultimatums. "Rachel, honey, you have to understand our position. We've been supporting 3 children for over 20 years. Your father and I are in our 50s now, and we need to start thinking about our own financial future. We can't keep subsidizing adult children who are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves." "Subsidizing?" I repeated. "I've been paying for my own personal expenses throughout college. I've never asked you for spending money or help with anything beyond basic room and board." "How is that subsidizing?" "Room and board isn't free," Dad interjected. "Do you know how much it costs to maintain this house? Utilities, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, all of that adds up. You've been living here for 22 years without contributing anything to those expenses." The conversation was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. They weren't just asking me to start paying rent, they were presenting a retroactive bill for 2 decades of parenting, as if providing housing for their minor child had been a loan that was now coming due with interest. "So what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, trying to understand whether this was a negotiation or an ultimatum. "Simple," Dad replied. "You can pay us $800 a month for room and board, plus contribute to utilities and groceries, or you can find your own place. We're not running a charity here." $800 a month was more than most people in our area paid for decent apartments, and it would be on top of contributing to household expenses. They weren't offering me a transitional arrangement to help me get established, they were proposing terms that were more expensive than living independently. "That seems like a lot more than it would cost me to rent my own apartment," I observed. Mom's response was telling, "Then maybe that's what you should do." "We're not trying to compete with landlords, Rachel. We're offering you the convenience of staying in your family home, but that convenience comes at a premium." The word convenience stung. They were characterizing my continued residence in the family home as a favor they were doing for me, rather than acknowledging any reciprocal benefit from my presence or contribution to the household. "And if I choose to move out?" I asked. "Then you move out," Dad said with a shrug. "You're an adult, you make your own decisions. But if you leave, you're choosing to leave. We're not kicking you out, we're giving you options." The semantics were important to them, apparently. They wanted to maintain the narrative that they were being reasonable and generous, offering me choices rather than issuing ultimatums. But the reality was that they had designed the terms to make staying financially impossible while maintaining plausible deniability about forcing me to leave. The most painful part of the conversation was the complete absence of emotional consideration. There was no acknowledgement that this decision might be difficult for me, no recognition that the timing was particularly hurtful, no expression of regret that our family relationship was changing so dramatically. They discussed my future living arrangements with the same detached pragmatism they might use to negotiate a business contract. "When do you need an answer?" I asked. "Tomorrow," Dad replied. "If you're staying, the rent starts on the 1st of next month. If you're leaving, we need time to prepare for the transition." As I lay in bed that night, processing the conversation and trying to decide how to respond, I realized that this moment had revealed something fundamental about how my parents viewed me and our relationship. In their minds, I was no longer their daughter who deserved love, support, and consideration. I was a tenant who could be evaluated purely on financial terms. The successful, independent young woman they had raised wasn't a source of pride, she was a business opportunity. My achievements hadn't earned their respect, they had eliminated their sense of obligation toward me. My self-sufficiency wasn't admirable, it was evidence that I no longer needed or deserved their care. By morning, I had made my decision. If they wanted to treat our relationship as a business transaction, I would respond accordingly. But I would do it on my own terms, with my own timeline, and with a clarity about their priorities that would guide every future interaction between us. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I could see my family dynamics without the filter of hope, obligation, or the desperate desire for their approval that had clouded my judgment for so long. They had shown me exactly who they were and what I meant to them, and I was finally ready to believe him. I spent the morning making phone calls and setting plans in motion with an efficiency that surprised even me. My first call was to accept the job offer from Technovate First, the innovative startup that had offered me the highest salary and the most interesting work. They were thrilled to hear from me and confirmed that I could start the following Monday, giving me exactly 1 week to get my life organized. My second call was to my college roommate Jessica, who had moved to the city after graduation and was looking for someone to split the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment she'd found in a great neighborhood. The timing was perfect. She needed a roommate, and I needed immediate housing that would cost me significantly less than my parents' proposed rent while offering me complete independence and a social life with someone who actually valued my company. "Are you serious?" Jessica asked when I explained my situation. "Your parents are charging you $800 a month to live in your childhood bedroom? Rachel, you can get a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment for that price, or we can split this amazing 2-bedroom for $450 each. Plus, you'd be living with someone who actually likes you." Her outrage on my behalf was both validating and healing. Someone who cared about me was horrified by my parents' treatment, confirming that their behavior was as unreasonable as it felt. My third call was to my Aunt Margaret, Dad's sister, who had offered support at the graduation dinner. I wanted to thank her for her kindness and let her know that I was handling this situation, but also to ensure that someone in the extended family understood the full scope of what was happening. "Oh, honey," Aunt Margaret said when I explained the rent ultimatum and my decision to move out immediately. "I've been worried about you since last night. Your father's announcement was completely inappropriate, but I had no idea it was this calculated and cold." She continued, "I want you to know that your uncle and I are incredibly proud of everything you've accomplished, and we think your parents are making a terrible mistake. You're always welcome here if you need anything, and I hope you'll stay in touch regardless of what's happening with your parents." I need to pause here because what happened next changed everything, and I mean everything. You're probably thinking this story is about me struggling to make it on my own after my parents kicked me out, but you're wrong. This is about what happened when they realized exactly what they'd lost, and how quickly their financial calculations changed when the consequences of their choices became clear. Make sure you're subscribed because the next part of this story is going to show you karma in action, and it's absolutely beautiful. The fourth call was the most important one, and the one that would ultimately reshape our entire family dynamic in ways none of us could have predicted. I called my parents' mortgage company to inquire about removing myself as a co-signer on their home loan refinancing that I had agreed to help with 6 months earlier. During my senior year of college, my parents had decided to refinance their mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates and access some of their home equity for renovations. However, their application had been declined due to changes in Dad's employment status and some credit issues that had arisen from Mom's brief period of unemployment the previous year. Their loan officer had suggested adding an additional cosigner with strong credit and stable income to strengthen the application. Given my excellent credit score, the documentation of my job offers, and my history of financial responsibility, I had agreed to co-sign the new mortgage to help my parents secure better terms and save money on their monthly payments. At the time, it had felt like a meaningful way to contribute to the family and demonstrate my appreciation for their support throughout my education. The loan officer had praised our family's financial planning and cooperation, commenting on how wonderful it was to see a young adult helping their parents in such a significant way. But now, understanding how my parents viewed our relationship and their plans for my immediate future, I wanted to understand my options for removing myself from this financial obligation. If they wanted to treat me like a tenant rather than a daughter, I needed to protect myself from being financially tied to landlords who had already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize their financial interests over our family relationships. I need to understand the process for removing a cosigner from a mortgage, I explained to the customer service representative. Well, she replied, typically a cosigner can only be removed if the primary borrowers qualify for the loan independently, or if the loan is refinanced again without the cosigner. Let me pull up your account details. After a few minutes of research, she delivered news that I found both shocking and oddly satisfying. According to our records, your co-signature is actually essential for this loan. Your parents don't meet our current lending criteria without your income and credit profile being included in the application. If you were to be removed as a co-signer, they would need to either find another qualified co-signer or pay off the loan entirely. I asked her to send me documentation of my obligations and rights as a co-signer, as well as information about the process for requesting removal from the loan. She was happy to provide the details, noting that it was smart of me to understand my legal and financial responsibilities. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my parents had made a significant strategic error. In their rush to extract rent money from me, they had apparently forgotten that my financial cooperation was essential for their ability to maintain the very home they were threatening to evict me from. I spent the rest of the day packing my belongings and making arrangements for the move. Jessica and I signed the lease on our apartment that afternoon, with a move-in date of the following weekend. The apartment was beautiful, affordable, and located in a vibrant neighborhood full of young professionals who were starting their careers and building independent lives. That evening, I sat down with my parents to inform them of my decision. "I've decided to move out," I announced calmly. "I found an apartment, signed a lease, and I'll be moving this weekend." They looked surprised, as if they hadn't expected me to make such quick arrangements. "Well, that's probably for the best," Mom said, though her tone suggested some uncertainty about whether this outcome was actually what they had wanted. "I'm sure you'll do fine on your own," Dad added, but I could hear a slight hesitation in his voice that hadn't been there the night before. "I'm sure I will," I agreed. "Oh, and I've contacted the mortgage company about removing myself as co-signer on your refinancing. I should be hearing back about the process within a few days." The silence that followed was deafening. The change in my parents' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Dad's face went pale, and Mom actually gasped audibly when I mentioned the mortgage co-signing situation. It was clear that in their calculations about charging me rent or forcing me to move out, they had completely forgotten about my crucial role in their current financial arrangements. "Now wait a minute," Dad said, his previous casual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. "There's no need to do anything hasty about the mortgage. That's a completely separate issue from your living arrangements." But I had learned something important from their approach to my graduation dinner announcement. Sometimes the most important conversations need to happen when you have leverage, not when it's convenient for the other party. "Is it a separate issue?" I asked calmly. "You've made it clear that our relationship is now based on financial transactions rather than family obligations. I'm simply applying that same logic to all of our financial arrangements." Mom tried a different approach, switching to the concerned parental tone she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while getting her way. "Rachel, honey, you're not thinking clearly about this. The mortgage affects our ability to keep the family home. This is where you grew up, where all your memories are. You wouldn't want to do anything that could jeopardize that." The appeal to sentiment and family memories was particularly ironic coming from someone who had just finished explaining that my 2 decades of residence in the family home had been an expensive burden rather than a cherished part of our shared history. "You're right that this is where I grew up," I replied. "But you've made it clear that this is no longer my home. You've told me that my continued presence here is contingent on paying rent that's more expensive than living independently. So why should I maintain financial responsibility for a property that I'm not welcome to live in?" Dad attempted to regain control of the conversation by reverting to his authoritative parental persona. "Rachel, you made a commitment when you co-signed that mortgage. You can't just walk away from legal obligations because you're upset about paying rent." His attempt to lecture me about commitment and responsibility was breathtaking in its hypocrisy. These were the same people who had publicly humiliated me at my graduation dinner and given me 24 hours to decide between paying extortionate rent or leaving the family home. "You're absolutely right about legal obligations," I agreed. "That's why I'm going through the proper legal channels to understand my options and responsibilities. The mortgage company is sending me documentation about the cosigner removal process, and I'll be consulting with a financial advisor to make sure I handle everything appropriately." The mention of involving external professionals, the mortgage company, a financial advisor, clearly made them nervous. They had assumed this would be a private family negotiation where they could use emotional manipulation and parental authority to get their way. Over the next few days, as I continued preparing for my move, my parents' attitude toward me underwent a complete transformation. The casual indifference and businesslike pragmatism disappeared, replaced by anxious attempts to repair our relationship and renegotiate my living arrangements. "We've been thinking," Mom said on Thursday evening, "maybe we were too hasty about the rent situation. We could work out something more reasonable, maybe just a small contribution to utilities and groceries." Dad nodded along eagerly. "Right, we don't need to make this complicated. You're family, and we want you to feel comfortable here while you get established in your career." The speed of their reversal would have been comical if it weren't so transparently motivated by their mortgage concerns. Within 3 days, I had gone from unwelcome tenant to beloved family member whose comfort and career were their primary concerns. "That's very kind of you to reconsider," I replied politely, "but I've already signed a lease and made arrangements with my roommate. I think living independently will be good for me." What they didn't know was that the mortgage company had already sent me the documentation I had requested, and the information was even more favorable to my position than I had initially understood. Not only was my co-signature essential for their current loan, but my removal would trigger a review process that could result in the loan being called due immediately if they couldn't qualify for refinancing independently. Moreover, as a co-signer, I had legal rights to information about the loan status, payment history, and any changes to the terms. I discovered that my parents had been less than completely honest about their financial situation when they had asked for my help with the co-signing. Their credit issues were more significant than they had disclosed. Dad's employment situation was less stable than I had been told, and they had used more of the home equity than they had originally planned. The mortgage payments they were now responsible for were substantially higher than their previous loan, and they had apparently been counting on my rent contributions to help them manage the increased financial obligation. Friday afternoon, I received a call from their mortgage loan officer, who had been contacted by my parents about the possibility of removing me as co-signer. "Miss Williams," she said, "I understand you're interested in being removed from your parents' mortgage. I have to tell you that based on our current assessment, your parents don't qualify for this loan amount without your financial profile being included in the application." She continued, "If you're determined to be removed from the loan, they would need to either pay off the current balance entirely, find another qualified co-signer, or accept a significant reduction in the loan amount that might require them to pay down the principal balance considerably." When I shared this information with my parents that evening, their panic became obvious and immediate. "Rachel, you can't do this to us," Mom pleaded, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "We'll lose the house if you force us into a situation where we can't meet the mortgage obligations." Dad tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and shared responsibility. "Look, we may have handled the rent discussion poorly, but we're still family. Families help each other through difficult times. We helped you by co-signing your student loans, and you helped us by co-signing the mortgage. That's what families do." But his attempt to create false equivalency backfired completely. They had never co-signed any student loans for me. I had received academic scholarships and had taken out federal loans that didn't require co-signers. He was confusing my situation with my siblings, who had required parental co-signing for various financial obligations. "Dad, you never co-signed any loans for me," I said quietly. "You're thinking of David's car loan and Lauren's credit cards." The realization that he had confused me with my siblings in his attempt to guilt me into protecting their financial interests was the final confirmation I needed about how little attention they had ever paid to my actual experiences and achievements. By the time moving day arrived, my parents' panic had escalated into full-scale crisis mode. They had apparently spent the weekend researching their options and discovering that my removal as co-signer would indeed create serious financial problems that they were not prepared to handle. Saturday morning, as Jessica and I loaded my belongings into a rental truck with help from Marcus and several college friends, my parents hovered anxiously around the driveway, making increasingly desperate attempts to change my mind about both the move and the mortgage situation. "Rachel, please, can we just talk about this calmly?" Dad pleaded, following me back and forth between the house and the truck. We can work something out that's fair to everyone. But their version of fair had been clearly established at my graduation dinner, and I was no longer interested in negotiations that started from the premise that my needs and feelings were secondary to their financial convenience. "We are talking calmly," I replied as I carried a box of books to the truck. "You made your position clear about what kind of relationship you wanted with me, and I'm responding accordingly." Mom tried a different approach, appealing to my friends and Marcus who were helping with the move. "I hope you all understand that this is just a family disagreement," she told them with forced cheerfulness. "Sometimes families have different ideas about transitions to independence. We're very proud of Rachel's success." But Marcus, who had witnessed my tears and confusion after the graduation dinner, was not inclined to play along with her attempt to normalize the situation. "It's great that you're proud of her," he replied coolly. "She's accomplished amazing things, and she deserves family support as she starts this exciting new phase of her life." His comment, delivered with perfectly polite tone but unmistakable meaning, made it clear that my friends understood exactly what kind of family disagreement this actually was. Jessica, who had heard the full story of my parents' ultimatum, was even more direct. "Rachel's going to love living in the city," she told my parents enthusiastically. "Our apartment is beautiful, the neighborhood is full of young professionals, and the rent is so reasonable compared to what some people charge for less desirable situations." Her emphasis on reasonable rent and less desirable situations was subtle but pointed, letting my parents know that their proposed financial arrangements had been discussed and judged by people outside the family. As we loaded the last of my belongings, my parents made one final attempt to address the mortgage situation directly. "Rachel," Dad said, pulling me aside for what he clearly intended to be a private conversation, "I need you to understand what removing yourself from the mortgage could mean for our financial stability. This house is our primary asset, our retirement security. If we lose it because of a family disagreement about rent, that affects our entire future." His appeal to consequences was ironic given that he had apparently given no consideration to how his graduation dinner announcement might affect my emotional well-being or our long-term family relationships. "I understand that your financial situation is important to you," I replied. "I'm sure you can understand that my financial independence is important to me too. The mortgage company will review your application and make whatever decision they think is appropriate based on your qualifications." Mom joined the conversation, her voice taking on the desperate edge that appeared whenever she felt like she was losing control of a situation. "But Rachel, we're family. Family doesn't abandon each other over money disagreements. We raised you, we supported you, we helped make your success possible. Doesn't that earn us some loyalty and consideration?" Her appeal to family loyalty was particularly galling coming from someone who had just spent a week treating me like a problematic tenant rather than a beloved daughter. "You're absolutely right that family shouldn't abandon each other over money," I agreed. "I hope you'll remember that principle in the future." As Jessica and I drove away from the house where I had spent my entire childhood, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief that surprised me with its intensity. I was grieving the loss of the family relationships I had always hoped for, while simultaneously feeling liberated from the constant effort of trying to earn love and approval from people who had apparently never valued me the way I had valued them. "You okay?" Jessica asked as we pulled into traffic, the rental truck following behind us with Marcus at the wheel. "I think I am," I said, and realized that I meant it. For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I stand with them. It hurts, but it's also freeing. The apartment Jessica had found was everything she had promised: spacious, beautifully located, and significantly less expensive than what my parents had demanded for a single room in their house. As we unpacked my belongings and arranged my new living space, I felt a sense of possibility that had been missing during my final weeks at home. But the real satisfaction came Monday morning, when I started my new job at Technovate First. The work was challenging and engaging, my colleagues were brilliant and collaborative, and the salary was even better than I had hoped. By the end of my first week, I knew I had made the right choice about both my living situation and my career path. Meanwhile, my parents' situation was deteriorating rapidly. They had apparently spent the week after my move consulting with financial advisors, mortgage brokers, and attorneys about their options for removing me as co-signer or refinancing their loan independently. The news they received was uniformly discouraging. Their credit scores, employment history, and debt-to-income ratio made them poor candidates for refinancing without a co-signer. The amount they would need to pay down on their current mortgage to qualify for a smaller loan independently was substantial, money they didn't have access to without taking on additional high-interest debt. Their attempts to find alternative co-signers had been equally unsuccessful. David was financially overextended with his own mortgage and car payments. Lauren's credit had been damaged by some poor financial decisions during her early 20s. Extended family members who might have been willing to help were either not financially qualified or had been put off by the circumstances of my departure from the family home. 2 weeks after my move, Dad called me at work, something he had never done before in my entire career. "Rachel, I hope you're settling in well at your new job," he said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't mask his underlying anxiety. "I am, thank you," I replied politely. "The work is interesting and the team is great." "That's wonderful. Listen, I was wondering if we could meet for lunch sometime this week. I'd like to discuss some family financial matters with you." The phrase "family financial matters" was telling. He was no longer framing our relationship in terms of rent obligations or household contributions. Now he was appealing to family solidarity around shared financial concerns. "I'm pretty busy getting established in my new role," I said. "Maybe we could talk on the phone instead." "Well, this is really something that would be better discussed in person. It's about the mortgage situation, and I think we can find a solution that works for everyone." His insistence on an in-person meeting suggested that he was planning to use emotional manipulation and family pressure tactics that would be more effective in a face-to-face conversation than over the phone. "Dad, if you want to discuss the mortgage co-signing situation, you should probably have that conversation with the mortgage company and your attorney. I've already spoken with a financial advisor about my options and obligations." The mention of my own financial advisor clearly rattled him. He had apparently assumed that I would handle this situation without professional guidance, making me more vulnerable to family pressure and guilt trips. "Rachel, please. Can't we just sit down and talk like family? This mortgage issue affects all of us, and I'm sure we can work out something reasonable." But his definition of reasonable had been clearly established 2 weeks earlier when he had announced at my graduation dinner that I could pay rent or get out. I was no longer interested in his version of family negotiations. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm confident that the mortgage company will handle the situation appropriately based on the terms of the original agreement." 3 days later, Mom called me at my apartment, her voice carrying the kind of emotional intensity she typically reserved for major family crises. "Rachel, we need to talk. This mortgage situation is becoming impossible, and I think you're letting your hurt feelings cloud your judgment about what's best for the family." Her attempt to frame my response as emotional irrationality rather than logical consequence was predictable but still infuriating. "Mom, I'm not letting emotions cloud my judgment. I'm making rational decisions about my financial obligations based on how our family relationship has been redefined." "But this could destroy our family," she protested. "Is that really what you want? To tear apart everything we've built together over a disagreement about rent?" The irony of her concern about family destruction was breathtaking. She was the one who had supported Dad's decision to publicly humiliate me at my graduation dinner, who had defended their demand for rent that exceeded market rates for independent housing, who had treated me like an unwelcome tenant rather than a cherished daughter. "Mom, I didn't tear apart anything. I'm simply responding to the relationship terms you and Dad established. If those terms are causing problems for you, maybe you should reconsider whether they were appropriate in the first place." The phone calls continued throughout the following weeks, each one revealing more about the severity of their financial situation and their growing panic about the consequences of their decisions. They had apparently consulted with multiple mortgage professionals, all of whom had delivered the same message: without my co-signature, they could not maintain their current mortgage and would need to either pay down the loan significantly or sell the house. The house they were now at risk of losing was the same one they had told me was too expensive for me to live in without paying rent. The mortgage they couldn't maintain without my financial profile was the one they had forgotten about when calculating that my success meant they no longer needed to support me. But the calls weren't just about the mortgage anymore. As word of our family situation spread through their social circles, partly through my Aunt Margaret, who was understandably upset about how they had treated me, my parents began facing social consequences that they hadn't anticipated. "People are talking," Mom admitted during one particularly emotional phone call. "They're asking questions about why you moved out so suddenly after graduation, and some of the things they're saying aren't very flattering to your father and me." The social embarrassment was clearly as distressing to them as the financial consequences. They had built their public image around being successful, caring parents, and my abrupt departure after graduation was raising questions that they were finding difficult to answer satisfactorily. "What are you telling people?" I asked. "We're trying to explain that it was a mutual decision about your independence, but..." She trailed off, apparently unable to complete the sentence. "But people aren't buying that explanation? Some people are suggesting that we pushed you out too quickly, or that we weren't supportive enough during your transition. It's very hurtful to hear our parenting being questioned." Their concern about public perception was revealing. They weren't calling to apologize for their treatment of me or to acknowledge that they had made mistakes. They were calling because their reputation was suffering and they wanted me to help them manage the damage. 6 months after my graduation dinner humiliation, my parents' situation had become completely untenable. The mortgage company had initiated the cosigner removal process, which triggered a comprehensive review of their financial qualifications. The review confirmed what I already knew: without my income and credit profile, they could not maintain the loan terms they had secured with my help. Their options were stark and expensive. They could pay down approximately $60,000 of the principal balance to qualify for a smaller loan independently, or they could sell the house and find more affordable housing that matched their actual financial capacity without my co-signature. Neither option was particularly appealing to people who had gotten accustomed to living beyond their means with the help of their daughter's excellent credit and stable income prospects. But the financial consequences were only part of their growing crisis. The social fallout from their treatment of me had spread throughout their community in ways that were damaging their reputation and relationships. My Aunt Margaret had been vocal about her disapproval of their behavior, sharing details of my graduation dinner humiliation with extended family members who were horrified by their treatment of their most successful child. The story had spread through their church community, their neighborhood social circles, and Dad's professional network. The narrative that emerged was not flattering. Successful parents who had kicked out their summa cum laude daughter immediately after graduation, demanding rent that exceeded market rates for independent housing, then panicking when they realized their financial dependence on her continued cooperation. "People are saying we're greedy and ungrateful," Mom admitted during one of her increasingly frequent and desperate phone calls. "They're saying we drove away the best thing that ever happened to our family." The recognition that I might have been the best thing that ever happened to our family was gratifying, even though it had taken financial consequences to make them realize it. Meanwhile, my own life was flourishing in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My work at Technovate First had earned me rapid recognition and additional responsibilities, along with a substantial raise after my first quarterly review. I was being considered for a promotion that would make me the youngest team lead in the company's history. Living with Jessica had been wonderful. We had developed a close friendship based on mutual respect and shared goals, and our apartment had become a gathering place for other young professionals who were building independent, successful lives. I was dating someone new, a software engineer named David who treated me with the kind of consistent care and respect I had never experienced in my family relationships. Most importantly, I had discovered what it felt like to live without constantly seeking approval from people who were incapable of giving it freely. The anxiety and self-doubt that had characterized my family relationships were replaced by confidence and peace that came from knowing I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. The contrast between my flourishing independence and my parents' deteriorating situation became more apparent with each passing week. While they were struggling with financial stress, social embarrassment, and the prospect of losing their home, I was thriving professionally and personally in ways that demonstrated exactly what they had thrown away. The phone calls from my parents became increasingly desperate and manipulative, cycling through guilt trips, threats, bargaining, and occasional moments of what seemed like genuine remorse. "Rachel, please, we're begging you," Dad said during a particularly emotional call. "We made mistakes, we admit that. But we're family, and families find ways to forgive and move forward together. We've learned our lesson," Mom added, clearly listening on speakerphone. "We understand now how valuable you are, how much we took you for granted. Can't we find a way to fix this?" Their appeals to family loyalty were particularly ironic coming from people who had demonstrated that their own loyalty was conditional on financial convenience and social appearances. "I'm glad you've learned from this experience," I replied calmly. "That's exactly what consequences are supposed to accomplish." The turning point came when they received notice that their mortgage would be called due within 90 days unless they could qualify for refinancing independently or find a qualified cosigner. The reality of losing their home had finally made them understand the full scope of what their graduation dinner ultimatum had cost them. "Rachel," Dad said during what would be our final conversation about the mortgage situation, "I need you to know that if we lose this house, it will destroy everything we've worked for our entire lives." "I understand that's a difficult situation," I replied. "I'm sure you can understand that being publicly humiliated at my graduation dinner and then given 24 hours to pay extortionate rent or leave the family home was also difficult for me. But we can fix our mistakes." Mom interjected desperately. "We can apologize, we can make it up to you, we can be the family we should have been all along." Her promise to be the family we should have been all along was an admission that they had been failing as parents long before the graduation dinner incident. But it was an admission that came only after they faced consequences they couldn't manage or avoid. "Mom, the time to be that family was 22 years ago, or at my high school graduation, or when I earned my scholarship, or any of the hundreds of times I achieved something that should have made you proud. You can't decide to value me now just because you need my financial help." The silence that followed was long and heavy with the weight of recognition that their opportunity to have a loving, supportive relationship with me had been squandered through years of conditional love and transactional thinking. 6 weeks later, they sold the house at a significant loss and moved into a much smaller rental property that matched their actual financial capacity without my co-signature. The downsizing was dramatic and public, requiring them to explain to friends and neighbors why they were suddenly unable to maintain the lifestyle they had projected for years. Meanwhile, I used part of my promotion bonus to put a down payment on my own small house in the city, a beautiful Victorian cottage that I shared with David after we got engaged 8 months later. The house was entirely my own achievement, purchased without cosigners or family assistance, a symbol of the independence and success I had built despite my family's lack of support. Looking back on this experience, I realized that my parents taught me something incredibly valuable, though not in the way they intended. They showed me the difference between transactional relationships and genuine love, between conditional approval and unconditional support. Their rejection forced me to build a life based on my own worth rather than their validation. Have you ever had family members who only valued you when they needed something from you? How did you handle discovering that their love came with strings attached? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us recognize that we're not alone in dealing with family members who treat relationships like business transactions. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I share more stories about family dynamics, toxic relationships, and the journey to building genuine independence. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and please share this with anyone who might need to hear that they don't owe family members their financial security just because they share DNA. Thank you for watching and for all the support you show by engaging with these videos. Remember that your success doesn't obligate you to support people who didn't support you, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. Family relationships should be based on mutual love and respect, not financial convenience and social appearances. Take care of yourselves, trust your worth, And remember that you deserve people in your life who celebrate your achievements instead of trying to profit from them. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep building the life you deserve with people who genuinely value who you are.